Welcome to the Lakeshore Christian Church Midweek podcast. I'm Pastor Randy Cordell. We're coming to you live from our studio at our Antioch campus here in Nashville, Tennessee. We're happy to have you joining us today. If you haven't already done so, we'd love for you to become a subscriber to the podcast. Invite others to do so as well. We come to you live at noon on Wednesdays each week, but then once it's posted, you can listen to it anytime after that on most popular podcast platforms. Each week on the podcast, we spend some time reviewing the message series that we're in at Lakeshore. And right now we're in a series going through the book of Exodus. And the theme is how God draws us out to draw us in. Each week we've been looking at how God has this plan that he's working. And oftentimes the plan doesn't look like we think it's going to look. It doesn't work the way we think it's going to work. But the more we learn about the character of God, the love of God, the concern God has for his people, the more we know we can trust him, even when we don't see or understand why things are happening the way they are. Well, this week we looked at Exodus. We're in chapter 2, beginning with verse 11. And this is picking up on a time in Moses' life where he's grown up and he's living there in Pharaoh's household in Egypt. And it says one day he went out and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. And it so stirred him to watch that, to see that happening, that he looked around, made sure nobody was watching, and then he rose up and killed the Egyptian. Then he tried to hide it. Of course, he had to bury the body, and he was just hoping that nobody was going to find out about what had happened. We know, though, that the next day he sees two Hebrews arguing with each other, fighting with each other, and he tries to interject there and take up for the one who was in the right and question the one who was in the wrong there. And then that man asked Moses, who made you a judge over us? Are you going to kill me like you did the Egyptian? So he knows now it's been discovered. He knows that what he's done may have already gotten back to Pharaoh, and so he flees for his life, and he goes to Midian. And there in Midian, he says he sits by this well, but he sees these daughters that come together with their father's flock to water their flock, but some shepherds come along and try to run them off. And then Moses takes up for them and gets the shepherds out of the way and allows himself, he chooses to water the flock of these young ladies himself, and they are very grateful. Of course, they go back home and tell their dad about it, and Dad says, hey, you need to invite him over to the house for dinner. Why didn't you do that already? He ends up going there, getting to know that family. He ends up marrying one of the daughters, settling down there, and they have a child together, and he gets a job. We find out as we read the rest of the story, we can look ahead there, he actually starts caring for the flock of his father-in-law there. All of that to say that Moses, in that account, has some very good traits that we pointed out. And I want to just review those traits a little bit of some good things that we see in Moses' life, and then to see a challenging thing in his life that's going to really play a big part. These good traits and the challenging thing are going to play a big part in God using him in this overall plan that he has. One of the traits we see is obvious here, but then it's referred to again in the New Testament, is I use the adjective mighty, that we see that he was mighty. And in Acts chapter 7, we find this is a great connection to the book of Exodus here. Actually, it's a retelling of this story. Stephen, who ends up becoming the first Christian martyr, is being questioned by the Sanhedrin about his preaching and his teaching and his calling people to know and follow Jesus. And in his response to the Sanhedrin, he actually preaches a sermon, and we have it recorded there in Acts chapter 7. And in that sermon, he really goes back and reviews this time period where God is calling Moses and using Moses for his purposes. And in Acts 7, verse 22, he says this: Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. So here's what we know. Moses was, at the time of this account, 40 years old. He spent 40 years being instructed in all the wisdom of Egypt. He is a cultural elite in Egypt. Part of Pharaoh's household. He was raised as Pharaoh's daughter's son. So there's no manner of education offered at that time that he's not been coached on or trained in and taught. And because of that, it's equipping him. He may not realize it yet, but it's part of how God is equipping him to do this thing in the big story of God's plan for his people. He's equipping Moses, preparing Moses to be powerful in speech and action. So he's persuasive and he can back it up, and he's been trained with the highest level of education possible for that day and time. Now, he would not have been able to have that without being there in Pharaoh's household. Not as they lived in Egypt. He would never have been included in this, except for the story we've already seen the previous week of how he ends up being there in Pharaoh's household. So we know God is working to prepare Moses, and one of the ways he's being prepared was that he was being prepared to be powerful in speech and in action, as Stephen says there in Acts chapter 7. But we also see another character trait of Moses in this account, and that is that how courageous he was. Now, courage can sometimes be used in the wrong ways, but we see courage has been developed in the heart and the mind of Moses. He has, in this training, this education that he received, part of that education, the way Egypt was doing at that time and that culture, was they were being trained, a certain group would be trained to be the elite of the people. And there was a big separation between those who were seen as the elite and the rest of the population of Egypt. It's like in a lot of societies, and even in America we have some of this. Of course, there are people that seem to be in our culture, in our society, more the elite in the world's eyes. They are wealthy, or they're well educated. They have powerful positions or jobs or titles, and that puts them on a different level in the way the world looks at people. And in Egypt, it was that way as well. But those that were being trained to be the elite, who were part of those families that were considered to be the elite class in Egypt, they would be exposed to this education that others would not get. And they would be taught that they were elite, that they should see themselves that way, that they were superior to those who were not of the elite class in Egypt. And so they were trained to look down on those who weren't part of their group. So Moses had been educated with all this wisdom of Egypt, and he's been sitting under this teaching, and this empire has tried to shape him as an elite by teaching him that his people not only were some of the Egyptians beneath him, but his people, the Hebrews, were certainly well beneath them of all of the Egyptians. They were considered in Egypt to be almost subhuman, not exactly fully human as a people. So they were truly having ingrained in their minds that these slaves living under the authority of Egypt were more like almost animals to them, to be treated any way they wanted, to be used any way they wanted for their own purposes. And it was okay. And he had witnessed how it was backed up in action, even with violence against his own people. So he's witnessed that for years in his training and his education. And Moses grew up not just being taught that, but experiencing that in the household of Pharaoh, all around him every day. And what Moses chooses to do in his courage, as misguided as it was, he thought in his courageous act of killing this Egyptian that somehow that was going to be good for his people. They would see him as a hero, but he also understood that if he did that, when he did that it would be an embarrassment to the house of Pharaoh, and that there would be dire consequences connected to what he had done. So it did require some courage for him to do what he did. Even though it was misguided courage, we see this character trait in him. In Hebrews 11, verses 24 and 25, it tells us something about Moses too. It says, by faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. So he made a courageous choice to identify with his people, not just in that one instance, but also when he broke up the fight between the two Hebrew men that were fighting. And he was showing courage. When he ran off the shepherds to help these girls in Midian, these young ladies that came to water their father's flock, he was showing some courage there to stand up against that group of shepherds there. So we see this character trait rising up over and over again in the life of Moses. And it wasn't always directed the right way, but certainly we could see courage rising up there. But we also see another character trait in Moses' life in all of these instances, and that is that he also has compassion. He's courageous, he's powerful in speech and action, but he has a compassionate heart toward those that are suffering injustice. Not everyone's stirred by injustice. We should be, but not everyone is. When we see people being mistreated, when we see them being treated unfairly, does that stir us up? Does that cause our heart to go out to them when we see that? That's what Moses was experiencing. And again, it's not always guided in the right way. He doesn't always respond in that feeling of compassion the way he should, but compassion is a good trait. It's something God has for us. It's something, if we're going to grow up to be like him, that we need to develop in our own lives too. So all through chapter 2 here with verse 11, when he rises up against the one beating one of his own people, in verse 13, when he tries to settle the argument between two of his own people, and in verse 17, when we see how he is defending these girls that came to water their flock, he is in every case partially motivated to be courageous because of his compassion. And so with all of these great character traits, you can see easily how this could be a person that could be used by God in some great ways. But there is another trait that is more of a flaw in Moses' life. And I think we can all, if we're honest with ourselves, relate to this flaw. We can see some of this in us that we see in Moses. I think what we see happening in this text is Moses had this tendency to want to take matters into his own hands, to do things his way, before talking to God, without listening to God, without seeking God's direction or godly counsel before he took action. He often would just take matters into his own hands. We see that repeated pretty consistently in Moses' life. But I think if we're honest, we see some of that in ourselves. We see ourselves wanting to do things our way, in our timing, and we want things to work the way we want them to work, so we try to force that to happen the way we want it to happen, instead of really trusting God to be God in our lives. I said this past Sunday that that's really a form of idolatry, and the idol that we're talking about here is the idol of self. I got this from another pastor. I really like this. I just thought this was so insightful. He said this: you live life one of two ways. You trust God, or you're trying to be him. There's really no middle ground there. Either we trust God to be God, we know we can trust him as God, or we start trying to be God ourselves, our own God of our own lives. And when we start trying to do that, there are a lot of motivating factors for it. They're not necessarily bad things if they're in check, if they're handled the way they need to, but out of control, these things can cause us to worship the idol of self. I broke it down to a few areas, 4 areas of this self-worship, this making an idol of self. One of those areas is when it comes to comfort. Now, I'm all about comfort. I love to be comfortable. I think everybody loves comfort. That's part of our human nature, and it's part of, there's nothing evil about that. We enjoy being comfortable, and there's certain things we're comfortable doing, certain things we're not comfortable doing, certain things that we would prefer over other things because they're more comfortable for us. Well, Moses had to deal with that. We're going to see in the next several weeks here, as God comes to Moses to call him to go back to Egypt after he's been in Midian for 40 years, we can imagine that he's become pretty comfortable living in Midian. He gets married, he has a family, he has a job, he lives out in a remote area where he's got land out in the country, right? He doesn't have to deal with all the pressures that might have been part of his life had he stayed in Egypt. And so that would be a more comfortable place to be when God says, I want you to go back to Egypt. And when God, we're going to see over the next few weeks, when God does that, Moses starts making all these excuses about why he is not the right choice for it. I think part of what's motivating that is this idol worship of self, where we want to put comfort ahead of everything else. There's a lot of things in God's Word and God's plan for our lives that are uncomfortable for us. And everybody's personality is different, so what's uncomfortable for me may not be for you, and vice versa. But there are things God teaches us, calls us to do, that call us out of our comfort zone. It could be the way we handle our finances, or how we function as a husband or a wife, or how we function if you're single in the dating world in our culture today. There are things that God teaches that He says are right and best, and He wants to call us to those things, but we're more comfortable doing it the way our friends are doing it, the way the world is doing it, the way we think will give us what we want more quickly, or in the timing we want it to happen, or whatever. And so comfort can lead us, that desire for comfort, if we let it get out of control, can cause us to choose to be our own God instead of listening to what God is saying. Another area is control, and these are all connected, but we like to be in control, and some people have more of that than others in their lives. Have you heard the phrase control freaks? Sometimes we can cross that line into that control freak thing, where we're trying to control everybody and everything all the time. And the truth is, we're not God, and we can't control all those things, and trying to do that is only going to frustrate us even more. I think Moses really struggled in that area with wanting to be in control, wanting to do things the way he thought would be best. And that's connected to the desire for power. If you want to control things, you have to have a position or a title or some way to have the authority you think to be in control. So we look for those things that will give us what we think would be power to control. And so power can be a driving, motivating force to cause us to have this idol of self, where we put that ahead of what God wants for us. And then, of course, that's connected oftentimes to approval. We want people to like us, don't we? Everybody, I think, likes that to a certain degree, to be liked, especially to be liked by certain people that we want to like us. And oftentimes, if we let that get out of control, it could cause us to choose to do things that we know clearly are outside of God's will. But we do them because we think it will get people to like us more, or like us if we don't think they have liked us in the past. And popularity is it's a powerful driving force in a lot of people's lives, especially if you're worshiping self, if you're wanting self to be on the throne of your heart, your life. And so we need to learn from this example from Moses, and we're going to see more of this played out over the next several weeks here, of where we got to fight that urge to be God ourselves and really learn to trust God that He's got this plan. My life verse is Romans 12:1-2, and just verse 1. I just wanted to close to Sunday with this verse. It says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship." When we think about what it really means to worship God, it starts with this. We got to get ourselves off the throne and put God there. The throne of our hearts, the throne of our mind, the throne, our will needs to be surrendered completely. Our whole lives need to be surrendered. That's our true and proper way to worship God Himself. And then that's played out and lived out in every part of our lives. Well, next week we're going to go on and look at the final few verses of chapter 2. It's kind of a summary section of 3 verses there, where we see a reminder. It's really a turning point in all of the story of the book of Exodus, of all of the story of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. It's really a turning point. It's in Exodus 2, verses 23-25, where we see God reminding us that He hears us, He knows us, He loves us, He cares for us, and He really is working that good plan for us for His glory and for our good. So I hope you can join us next Sunday. We have our services at the Antioch campus at 9 a.m. and 11 a.m., and at our Smyrna campus we have a 10 a.m. service. We live stream our services every Sunday morning at 9 a.m., so we hope if you can't be with us in person, you will join us for the live stream. And then once it's streamed, we post it, and you can listen or watch anytime after that. Just very quickly, a couple things coming up. This coming Sunday's Mother's Day. We love celebrating Mother's Day at Lakeshore. We want you to be here if you can, if you're in the area, and celebrate with Mom. If you could be in church together with her, that would be great. We're going to have photo booths at both campuses, and we're going to recognize all the mothers that are present. We're going to have some giveaways for moms, some drawings for some giveaways. So it's going to be a fun time, and mothers certainly are deserving of being recognized and honored. So we hope you'll join us this coming Sunday. The following Sunday is Graduate Sunday, where we recognize and celebrate our high school graduates, and we hope all of our high school graduates can be present for that. We want to recognize you and this accomplishment in your life, and of course it's a big deal for you and for your parents that you're graduating from high school. We got the summer events coming up, the elementary summer camp, the summer youth conferences, all those things you need to get registered for there. I think that our summer youth conferences our groups are about full there, so make sure you've got that locked in if you haven't done so already. You can register for any events that you need to register for here at Lakeshore, either on our website at lakeshorechristian.com or at the kiosk at our campuses there in the lobby of either campus. Thanks again for joining us today. We love having you connect with us on the podcast as we continue to connect, grow, and serve here at Lakeshore Christian Church.